In the Crimean War, we often remember the charge of the Light Brigade, with shot and shell, and the stand of the Thin Red Line. But one of the most tumultuous and consequential events of the whole war was not a battle against the Russians, but a battle against nature itself. A single storm on the 14th of November 1854 would cause untold destruction in the Black Sea and would spell logistical disaster and terrible suffering to come. We'll see how poor logistics can make war hell just as easily as any of the horrors of war. This is the Great Storm of 1854. In early 1854, France and Britain sided with the Ottomans in the long struggle between the Russian and Ottoman empires, hoping to curtail Russian advances and restore the balance of power. Fighting initially began in 1853 along the Danube and in the Black Sea, and in November the Russians had obliterated the Ottoman fleet at anchor at Sinope. The British and French armies initially moved to Varna in modern-day Bulgaria, but to strike at the Russians directly, they decided to land on the Crimean Peninsula with the intent of capturing the port of Sebastopol and ending Russian naval presence in the Black Sea. They landed in September 1854 at Kalamata Bay and pushed across the Alma River, where they first defeated the Russian army in the field. But instead of advancing on and storming Sebastopol, the Allies were keen on settling in for a methodical siege. The intent was to save lives by avoiding a bloody series of assaults and slowly bringing up the heavy artillery to reduce the Russian defenses to ashes. But ironically, this would give time for the Russians to prepare their defenses, time for Allied logistics to crumble, and time for the harsh climate to wreak havoc on both sides. Besieging rather than storming Sebastopol would result in a series of bloody battles, drag on for nearly a year, and would prolong the sufferings of the soldiers in the field from exposure, hunger, and a slew of diseases. The British, French, and Turks marched around to the south and invested Sebastopol, digging siege lines around the town and establishing ports and rudimentary supply lines. The French, being the larger land force, took the large bay at Kamish, a few miles from Sebastopol, and the British had the port of Balaclava, a relatively small fishing harbor surrounded by steep cliffs. By the following year, there would even be a railroad, but for the present, in 1854, Balaclava was a shambles, miles from the siege lines with muddy roads and often no draft animals to bring any sort of wagons, which meant the individual soldiers had to trek down to the port, scramble for their supplies, and walk them back. Soldiers could be seen in pairs carrying a single artillery shell up the hill or stuffing their pockets with food or ammunition. Wood was hardly to be found in the Crimea, and there were tons of coal allocated for the soldiers to use, but this too had to be carried back. Within a month, the Russian army counterattacked, hoping to break the siege from the outside. Their first attack was famously repulsed at Balaclava on the 25th of October, and the next at Inkerman on the 5th of November. The Tsar commented around this time that, as it had against the Swedes and the French in past wars, the Russians' best commanders were Generals January and February. The cold, the rain, the mud, and the snow would be their best allies. The winter would come early in 1854, and its first concerted attack would come on the 14th of November. The weather would strip bare Allied inadequacies, particularly on the British side. The Times correspondent William Howard Russell wrote, "On the 14th of November came a new calamity, the hurricane. I had been in a listless state between walking and sleeping, listening to the pelting of the rain against the fluttering canvas of the tent, or dodging the streams of water which flowed underneath it, saturating blankets and collecting on the mackintosh sheet in pools. And gradually I became aware that the sound of the rain and the noise of its heavy beating on the earth had been swallowed up by the roar of the wind and by the flapping of tents outside. Presently the sides of the canvas, tucked in under big stones, began to rise, permitting the wind to enter and drive sheets of rain right into one's face. The pegs indicated painful indecision and want of firmness of purpose. The glimpses afforded of the state of affairs outside were little calculated to produce a spirit of resignation to the fate which threatened our frail shelter. The ground had lost solidity. Mud, nothing but mud, flying before the wind and drifting as though it were rain, covered the face of the earth. Let the reader imagine the bleakest common in all England, the wettest bog in all Ireland, and the dreariest mire in all Scotland, overhung by leaden skies and lashed by a tornado of sleet, snow, and rain. A few broken stone walls and roofless huts dotting it here and there, roads turned into torrents of mud and water, and then let him think of the condition of men and horses in such a spot on a November morning, suddenly deprived of their frail covering and exposed to bitter cold, with empty stomachs, without the remotest prospect of obtaining food or shelter. Think of the men in the trenches, the covering parties, the patrols, and the outlying pickets and sentries who had passed the night in storm and darkness, and who returned to their camp only to find fires out and tents gone. These men on whose vigilance the safety of our position depended, and many of whom had been for 8 or 10 hours in the rain and cold, who dared not turn their backs for a moment, who could not blink in their eyes. These are the trials which demand the exercise of the soldier's highest qualities. And though the sufferings clearly hit the common soldiers worst, Russell wrote how everyone was affected. With chattering teeth and shivering limbs, each man looked at his neighbour. Lord Raglan's house, with the smoke streaming from the chimneys, and its white walls standing out freshly against the black sky, was the cynosure of neighbouring eyes. Lord Lucan, meditative as Marius amid the ruins of Carthage, was sitting up to his knees in mud amid the wreck of his establishment. Lord Cardigan was sick on board his yacht in the harbour of Balaclava. Sir George Brown was lying wounded aboard the Agamemnon off Camish Bay. Sir de Lacy Evans, sick and shaken, was on board the Saint-Péray in Balaclava. General Bentinck, wounded, was on board the Carter. The Duke of Cambridge was passing a terrible time of it in the Retribution, and all the horrors of that dreadful scene off Balaclava. Pennefather, England, Campbell, Adams, Buller, in fact all the generals and officers were as badly off as the meanest private. The storm was an 11 on the Beaufort scale, 1 below a proper hurricane. The storm was actually being tracked across the continent, but no warning was sent. In fact, this storm is thought to have been the impetus for the establishment of an international meteorological service. With the morning of the 15th of November came a bright, cold sky, and our men, though ankle-deep in mud, cheered up when they beheld the sun once more. William Howard Russell. The camps were torn asunder. Roads were impassable. Ships lay rocking about the harbor, dismasted and swamped. The damage was tremendous, and went far beyond strewn equipment and sodden uniforms. 37 ships were wrecked, many with the vital supplies troops would need for the coming campaign. Ammunition lay at the bottom, drowned cattle floated in the harbor, and crates of equipment were trapped in wrecks being dashed against the rocks. Many ships were blown all the way ashore. In fact, the French ship of the line Henri IV was driven ashore near Eupatoria, and her crew was taken prisoner by Russian cavalry, and her wreck was set afire and burnt. HMS Prince, a 290-foot storeship, sank just outside the harbor with only 6 of her 150-man crew making it off alive. She took with her enough boots for the whole army, hospital clothing and supplies, tents, and most importantly, more than 40,000 winter greatcoats. Most of the men came to Crimea without them, their leaders expecting the campaign to be over by now, and vastly underestimating the harsh climate. Now tens of thousands of soldiers would need to endure the winter, with their thin uniform tunics alone, on the plains before Sebastopol. Thousands would die of frostbite and exposure, and thousands more would be left susceptible to the cholera and typhoid as disease raged through the camps. Some of the most steadfast courage would come not in the face of the enemy, but in the face of such hardship. It was killing work laying down for hours in the cold mud, returning to camp at daylight, wearied completely out with the cold, sleepy and hungry. Many a poor fellow suffering with ague or fever to find nothing but a cold bleak mud tent, without fire, to rest their weary bones in, and often not even a piece of moulded biscuit to eat, nothing served out yet. But often, as soon as we reached the camp, the orderly would call out, "Is Sergeant G in?" "Yes, what's up?" "You off for fatigue at once?" "Off to Balaclava, perhaps to bring up supplies, the shape of salt beef, salt pork, biscuits, blankets, shot or shell. Return at night completely done up. Down you go in the mud for a few hours' rest. That is, if there's not an alarm. And thus it continued, week in, week out, month in, month out. So much for honour and glory. Sergeant Timothy Gowing, 7th Royal Fusiliers. British logistics would be hard-pressed to bridge the gap in supplies. No one had prepared for the army to be encamped on an open plain for the winter. They didn't expect to lose all their supplies in a single storm. And all up and down the chain of command, angry letters flew about, casting blame in every direction. Requests were denied or delayed, or were drowned in paperwork, or debated for long periods, or ran into problems with suppliers or transports. Lord Raglan's request for horse feed in September of 1854 was finally fulfilled 8 months later, when the horses were all long dead. The Greatcoat itself is a great example of the circumlocution and frustration with bureaucracy that persists in a great measure to this day in Britain. At every level, people were set in their ways, obstinate and unchangeable. Lord Raglan specifically requested that a simpler form for the requisition of greatcoats be made. It had 2 schedules attached and 24 blanks, all to be filled out in duplicate. And remember, many soldiers of the time were illiterate. But there was resistance from the quartermaster, as they felt it would lead to great abuse, as regulations stated that a regimental greatcoat was only to be issued once every 3 years. Ironically, most British clothing wouldn't arrive until the spring. When photographer Roger Fenton photographed the war in the spring and summer of 1855, he convinced some of the soldiers to put on the winter clothing for a photograph, but in actuality it was boiling when this was taken. Officers often had access to privately purchased winter clothing, food, and supplies, and many officers even took leave of their men in the trenches and went to Constantinople to recuperate, or worse yet, steamed all the way back home for Christmas, though this drew significant criticism even at the time, and we should note that this behavior wasn't universal. Even Lord Raglan sent his own camp bed and warm clothing to a woman whom he was appalled to have found gave birth in the muddy trenches while her husband's regiment was manning the siege lines. The class differences in this war were stark, and so too were the racial differences. Ottoman troops were often only tasked with manual labor, and were left without adequate winter clothing, being largely at the mercy of their allies for supplies. Though available sources give us very little in terms of the personal experience of the Turks in the Crimea, we know they died in their thousands in full view of their allies. The French would soon rectify their need for winter clothing, with many soldiers receiving sheepskins or the famous crémière. In fact, many of their logistical issues would be solved during the winter of 1854. To begin with, they handled their food supply quite differently, with dedicated cooks preparing food at the regimental level, while British soldiers were issued with their own food, and left to prepare it on their own, often without the fuel to do so. Privation and suffering was the order of the day, all resulting from the lack of supplies and the inadequacies of the British logistical system, and nowhere is this better demonstrated than the infamous green coffee. A ration of raw coffee berry was served out, a mockery in the midst of all this misery. Nothing to roast the coffee, nothing to grind it, no fire, no sugar, and unless it was meant that we eat it as horses do barley, I don't see what the men could make of it, except that they have just done, pitched it into the mud. How patient these men of mine, how admirably they behave. Away they go, ankle deep in the mud and wet to the skin, down to the trenches. Thus is the British soldier most to be admired. This is his discipline. Here he is, in all his glory. Sir George Bell, 1st Royal Regiment. This doesn't even begin to address the sufferings resulting from the lack of adequate medical care, nor the actual hardship of fighting the war itself. But with these privations alone, we can see the bleak reality of war, and how the results of political and logistical failings far up the chain of command are borne by the common soldier in the field. This video is part of War is Hell, a YouTube collaboration discussing how war is indeed hell, no matter the era. For more of those, here's the playlist. That was the Great Storm of 1854 and the logistics of the Crimean War. Let me know what you think, and feel free to share your own opinions on the logistics and horrors of war down below. I am Daryl, known in genteel circles as the Lord Rivers, and this is the Ministry way astray.